Thank you all for coming. Just to let you know what's going to happen tonight. So I'm going to say just a few very brief things and introduce Ryan Gravel, who will speak also fairly briefly about the city design project and give you an outline of what that's all about. And then we'll hear from Dr. Nelson, and the reason for introducing Ryan and have him set some context here is that really this is the first big public meeting we're having in association with the city design project, and I'll speak to that in just a minute. But before I get into that, I did want to thank a few people. Number one, we have City Council Member Mary Norwood here in the front. If y'all could recognize her, a huge proponent of planning. Of course, my staff, my deputy Terry Lee will be here later. She had another event. She'll be coming and will help me at the end facilitate questions and conversation after Dr. Nelson's speech, and then the entire staff, Jody Manspach, who's been very involved and really is the person that got the city studio up and operating and has organized this event, and the studio staff and all the staff at the planning department. So. With that, a couple things about kind of why we're here. And you know, there's a lot of things that we need to work on. There's a lot of things we're working on, and they're very important things, many of them. But this is about one thing, which is understanding the future of the city. You know, I think if you ask yourself and you thought about some different American cities, what will they be like in 25, 35 years? There's a number of American cities that you would probably say, I can kind of envision them in 25, 35 years. They're not going to be terribly different than they are today physically. There's a lot of issues within that physical framework, but this is really about the design. So San Francisco or Chicago or Boston or Philadelphia, looking forward 25, 35 years, you probably know to a large degree what those places, you'd be pretty confident in what that place would look like. I think if you ask yourself, what will Atlanta look like in 25, 35 years, you might say, I don't know. You know, that's a question. And number one here then is that it's important for the city to have a sense of that. And we have many plans at City Hall. There's no question about it. Like most cities, there's many plans. I would suggest to you that it's hard to understand from looking at those plans what you want to be, what the city really wants to be. And by city, I mean us, the community of Atlanta, the citizens of Atlanta. What do we want the city to be in 25 to 35 years? Because we better get busy on that. We're growing. We're not going to wait for 25, 35 years to decide. We need to decide soon because we need to start shaping things. So that's why this is so important to us, is that it's one of the fundamental things that the city of Atlanta, for the residents of the city, needs to have, which is a very specific picture of what it wants to be. And all that means, it means many things, because the design of the city is a framework. I mean, it's a place within which we've got a lot of work to do, as we all know. How do you get around in that city? The only reason to be a much bigger city than we are today is that the city would be a better place to live in 25, 35 years. That's the whole point of this, is to design our future in the city. So this is the beginning of what will be about a 12-month process. We'll have many public events of all different types, not just like this, to involve residents in this process of determining our future. It'll be a very, very public process. The next event will be, I think, October 4th. Is that right? Does anybody confirm that? Yes? So October 4th will be the second event, and that will really be more time for Ryan to go through the framework of the city design. So October 4th, in the evening, again, 6 o'clock here at the library in this room, we will have the second event in this process, and that will heavily be Ryan, as I said. So we wanted to start with this because Dr. Nelson is here to talk to us about matters related to growth in this country, what's driving the growth of cities, what should our expectations be in terms of how much Atlanta grows over that period of time. And we wanted someone to come from outside of City Hall and outside of Atlanta to kind of critique our thinking about this and give us some expectation about what we should be shooting for as a community in terms of the growth of the city. And that's why this was entitled something like, How Big Can Atlanta Be? Because we want to understand what that design needs to accommodate. And Ryan is now going to come up, Ryan Gravel, who you all know, and is the only person that can do this project in the world, literally. I'm totally serious. Part of it is because Ryan and I don't need to communicate very much. You know, we just kind of know it's a very good working relationship, and he's going to go through just a little bit about the city design to set the stage for Dr. Nelson's presentation. Ryan, thanks.
Thanks, Tim, and you all know this, but I mean, we would not be doing this incredible project and effort without Mayor Reed and Commissioner Keene, and really appreciate his leadership on this. This is not something that cities do, most of them, and so for Atlanta to be a leader thinking about design and the design of the city in this way is truly remarkable and a dream job, and I'm really honored to be a part of it. What better place to be meeting tonight than the Central Library, and with a few shortcomings of wires and things hanging around, it's really cool to be here and to start using this facility in the way that it was intentioned. So we want to keep doing that if we can. I want to give a little bit of context for what we're talking about tonight. Tonight we're really just talking about the number, what we call the big number, which is what the population of the city of Atlanta is going to be. The region will grow by 2.5 million people over the next 20 plus years. It'll go from a region of 5.5 million to over 8, which is astonishing to think about, especially in light of the fact that we're not really doing much in terms of regional transportation. And so where all those people go really matters. And we think that the city of Atlanta will take a much larger proportion of that growth than it has historically. And you can see that when you look across the skyline and you ride down the Beltline and you look at some other places around town, there's a lot of growth. But we know that the growth is unbalanced also, and it comes with its challenges, and we need to prepare for that. And especially if the city is maybe, well, I don't want to spoil the number. I'll let Dr. Nelson talk about that. But whatever that big number is, it's going to require us to think hard about what we want to be, and do we want to recognize Atlanta when we're done, when we get there? Will we still love it? Is it a place that we want to live? And so the idea with the Atlanta City Design is to figure out what's special about this place, capture those things, and embed them in all the decisions that we make about how the city gets built out over time, so that as we grow, we become more of what Atlanta is and not less. But to start all of that, and we've been working on it a while, and as Commissioner said, we'll be ready to share a lot of that with you in just over a month on the 3rd or 4th of October. So super excited about that. But tonight's about the number, and so that's what we're going to talk about. And we have Dr. Nelson here to share it. I just wanted to give a little bit of context and just say the premise of the city design's approach to this number. There's two things that we wanted to say. The first one, the city of Atlanta is going to change, and not changing is not an option. There's no scenario where we don't change. We're going to change. Our change will involve significant growth, and if properly designed, we can leverage that growth to accomplish the city that we want, to shape the Atlanta that we want to become. It doesn't look like that. The second premise is this. It is that more people are better than fewer. So we're taking an aspirational view of the population growth in the city and saying that more people, while it certainly presents challenges, it also brings a lot of really great benefits, including more efficient services, for example, and more walkability and a stronger economy and better transit and everything else. So more people are better than fewer. A diverse population is better than a homogeneous one. And that the most strategic scenario for growth includes everybody. And so we want to be very intentional about how we design the city and the policies and investments and things that we put in place to support that future so that our ultimate Atlanta truly is for everyone. You'll hear a lot more about that in a month and in the coming months, but that's sort of the beginning of how we're sort of approaching the number. With that, I want to invite Dr. Nelson up to the stage. He is a professor of planning and real estate development at the University of Arizona. I know him from way back when he was at Georgia Tech, teaching in the planning department there, where he taught for over 15 years. His research is based in Atlanta, and while he has moved beyond us, he is certainly one of us, and a lot of his work and research continues to be in Atlanta because that's where he started. He talks about all kinds of things. His research is on all kinds of things, including urban containment and measuring plan effectiveness and infrastructure financing. What I remember being particularly fascinated about and the way that he talked about his work was this idea of cul-de-sac impact fees, which I thought were incredible because cul-de-sacs don't actually provide a lot of benefit to the rest of the city. There's no through connections, there's no, for people or for sewer or for anything else, they actually don't contribute to the greater good as much as through streets do, so they should pay for that. It's fine, it's America, but you should pay for it. So he's a big thinker, and he translates really wonky stuff into things that I understand, and most people can. He also knows Atlanta, as I said, so we wanted to invite him to talk about our big number, challenge us, push us, and put it in a national context. And so we are delighted that he's here to do that. He's going to, after this, sort of wrap up a report that will be a part of the city design and other efforts in the city. So thank you for having me. Thank you for coming. And thank you for having me as a student.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to adjust this. I am envious of Ryan's height. It's a great pleasure for me to come back to Atlanta once again. I've been gone 15 years. It seems like yesterday. But I do return routinely to lecture at the Georgia State Law School and other places, do some work around town occasionally. So I'm delighted to come back, and especially now to talk about the big number for Atlanta. This is when I was asked a couple months ago to do this. At first I thought, you people, you city council members and commissioner must be smoking something that's now legal in some states. But here we are, and the idea is really interesting, and I have a lot of information I'm going to show you. I'm going to necessarily gloss over many pieces of it, but I want to show you what I've done so that it's going to be available in some fashion on the website that the city has. It's going to be free for you to download. My report will be coming out very shortly, also available publicly. So though I will gloss over many of the fine points, those will be in the reports, I'll focus on the big numbers, the big concepts, and the really big opportunities facing Atlanta. So they gave me, 45 or so minutes to do this. I had to cut a 4-hour lecture down into 45 minutes or so, but we can do it. These are the general themes I'll be going over, but let's just move on to the presentation. A large share of my thoughts come from a book I wrote a couple of years ago only, Reshaping Metropolitan America. I did dedicate a copy of the book to the city of Atlanta that's available in Tim Keen's office. But please buy the book, published by Island Press, because all the royalties are pledged to student scholarship funds. So buy the book and support students. Now I start off with a comparison of attitudes towards growth. I did some time looking at Birmingham and comparing Birmingham to Atlanta when I was living in Atlanta. And I was struck by some very interesting comparisons. Atlanta and Birmingham metropolitan areas were roughly the same size in 1950. You can see the numbers here. Fast forward to 2014, and you can see a vast difference in the population size. One thing about Birmingham I learned, and it may be unfair, but I think I have it mostly right, is that they kind of like Birmingham the way it is. Yes, they'll grow, but they kind of like it the way it is. Atlanta is very different. Atlanta is welcoming. You all come down, is the theme I heard when I got here in 1987. And there's a certain positiveness about that I think it makes Atlanta very refreshing as a place to live and be and grow and study. And of course, the airport has a lot to do with that. The interesting story about how Mayor Hartsfield was able to negotiate with the federal government to put the airport not in Birmingham as initially proposed, but here in Atlanta. And as a consequence, you can see the vast difference. So Atlanta, we're going to talk about the city of Atlanta, 132 square miles thereabouts. It's been kind of that size for a long time. It's not going to add much more land. It's pretty fixed. So let's talk about Atlanta proper, the city of Atlanta, and look at some of the key numbers from the past. So in 1970, Atlanta hit its largest population ever, about 500,000 people. In 1990, it lost 100,000 people between 1970 and 1990. So it was like a lot of U.S. cities in losing population. It began growing some in the 2000s, and it's growing actually even more rapidly in the first part of this decade. And there's some important reasons for that. What I like to look at, though, are households. Households tell me something about housing demand. This is a very subtle thing, but I think you'll grasp it. In 1950, the average American household size was about 4.5 people per household. In 2010, it was about 2.5, almost half, not quite, but almost half. What that means is that if you take the same population in 1950, say a million people, and that same population in 2010, a million people, you'd have to have almost twice as many homes to house that population in 2010 as 1950. And so as a consequence, even though the city lost 100,000 people in 20 years between 1970 and 1990, it actually gained households, gained occupied housing units. So as we're seeing the demographics of the U.S. and of the city change. Now looking now at households only, in the 2000s the city grew somewhat, but look at the household growth between 2010 and 2015, this decade. We're seeing that the city has added 15% more households in just 5 years. That is remarkable. Now, is that unusual for the U.S.? We'll see momentarily whether it is or not. But this is very strong, healthy, and I would say for the most part, welcome growth for the city of Atlanta. So this is a complex chart. I'm actually going to dismiss this. I've got more important things to say a little later on. Well, not quite. Not quite. So two things I'll highlight here. Between 2000 and 2010, Atlanta was attracting a large share. This is the Atlanta share of the total region change. 14% of the total change in single-person households moved to the city of Atlanta. These were Gen Xers. These weren't necessarily millennials. These were Gen Xers moving into the city. And also people who lost their partners or in separation or divorces, many of them moved into the city. And you'd be surprised by many retirees moving to the city for its medical services and other amenities. Likewise, it gained population in households under 35 population. But let's look now at the more recent period, 2010-2014. Single-person households, Atlanta's share of the regional growth in single-person households was 25%. That's a surprisingly large number for such a small part of the total region that Atlanta frankly is. So Atlanta is very attractive to the single-person households, and by the way, most of those households are not young people. Maybe about a third, maybe 40% are. Most of them are the middle age and seniors who have lost partners in life stage transitions, moving back to the city, staying in the city for all the reasons the city gives them. Now, this number here, households under 35, these are millennials. And we're losing that population group because millennials are, I would call it arrested development. Millennials have been hammered by the Great Recession. The jobs weren't there, the opportunities weren't there, they're staying with their parents longer, they're doubling, tripling up in apartments much longer, they're deferring marriage, they're deferring child rearing much longer. They've been trapped in this Great Recession time warp. But the millennials exceed in population the baby boomers in equal periods of time. So there are more millennials now than boomers when they were around, 1950s and 60s. So it's only a matter of time before we see the millennials literally flood the market. The question that we all have as researchers is, what are they going to do? Where are they going to live? We don't really know. I have some ideas, but I don't have time to share those with you tonight. Okay, so what I also look at, I compare Atlanta to what we call aspirational cities. These happen to be cities roughly the same size as Atlanta, between 400,000 and 700,000 people in the city limits, in roughly comparable metropolitan areas, 2 million to 6 million. They're also inelastic. They're like Atlanta. They cannot grow out. They're hemmed in. They can't annex land, or at least not much. And so they're fixed. They're in growing metropolitan areas. And many of these cities are what I would call glamour cities. These are cities that people want to live in. Well, what are these cities, these comparative cities? Boston, Denver, Portland, Minneapolis, Seattle, and Washington, D.C., which also includes Arlington and Alexandria as part of the original D.C. plat from 1786 or thereabouts. So I compare between 2010 and 2014, I compare household share of growth for the region. So, for example, between 2000 and 2010, Atlanta captured about 5% of the region's total household growth. But between 2010 and 2014, it captured about 11% of the region's total household growth. Pat ourselves on the back. That looks wonderful. But how do we stack up to our aspirational peers? Well, Boston's a little different, but everybody else has been growing at phenomenal rates. In fact, the overall average, this is the overall average, among all the other aspirational cities, between 2010 and 2014, they were getting about 28% share of the total change in the region's household growth. That tells me that Atlanta is actually behind the demand curve, that there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of pent-up market demand for moving to and living in Atlanta, because Atlanta, frankly, you might think you're different, right? You might think you're different. You're not that much different from Denver or even from Boston or Minneapolis. You're different physically, certainly, and in terms of weather and terrain, but the people are not that different across the country. Some differences, but not that much. So how many people would want to live in Atlanta if they had the opportunity, if the housing was available, the jobs are available, and so on and so forth? Well, for this, I turn to the National Association of Realtors. They do a very good study every couple of years. It's a stated preference study. And what it does is it presents respondents with various choices or options. Would you choose this or that given these circumstances, and so on and so forth. So one of the questions that are asked would you want to own or rent an apartment or townhouse and have an easy walk to shops and restaurants and have a shorter commute to work? If that was a choice you had, would you choose it? 39% and basically 40% of every respondent across all the surveys, across all the years they've done this, say they would want that opportunity to live in that rent or own this attached unit. Now, 60% don't want it. 60% don't want that option, even if it's presented to them. But they've already got their option. It's called the single-family home in suburbs, and that's fine. Among the 39% or so who want that option, less than half actually have it. There is pent-up market demand around the nation and in Atlanta to meet this opportunity, to meet this market niche. But to bring it down to even a smaller scale, let's look at the people who want to live in a city near a mix of offices, apartments, and shops. The city really means a place like Atlanta, or Boston, or Seattle, or Minneapolis. The boundaries, the city limits of that city. It's not downtown. Talk about that for a second. Some people accuse me, Dr. Nelson, of saying that all millennials, 100% of millennials want to live downtown. I've never said that, but people have told me that I've said that. Once again, everybody, 1% of the metropolitan area's population wants to live downtown, even if it's a crummy place to live. And it's not just the homeless. So 1% of the 6 million people living in Metro Atlanta now want to live downtown, 60,000 people. And that's if the downtown is crummy. If the downtown is nice, amenities, parks, and so on and so forth, the number goes to 2%, a whopping 2%. It's 120,000 people right now who would want to live in downtown Atlanta. It is an attractive place. It's getting better all the time. That means 98% don't want to live downtown. Let's live with that. But what about those who want to live in the city, close to downtown or city neighborhood or walkable to places in a city? That's 15%. Now, 85% don't want that. 85% don't want that. But what about the 15% who do? In my business, we try to find a way to meet the market niches that are being unmet. This is an unmet market niche. We're not delivering on this market demand. If we run the numbers based on a credible National Association of Realtors survey, which I and many others trust, and many market analysts use the NAR's numbers to help them forecast market demand, let's look at the bottom number here, just for the sake of time. 15% of Metro Atlantans want to live in the city, and the city really is Atlanta. And it's not Marietta. Sorry, Marietta. It is Atlanta. Right now, today, that means 900,000 people want to live in the city of Atlanta. You have 500,000 now, so you have unmet market demand for another 400,000 people. But we're planners. We're looking ahead, 2050. In 2050, we'll have 9 million people in Metro Atlanta, maybe a touch more, actually. That means 1.3 million people in 2050 would want to live in Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, if given the opportunity. That's the market demand. That's the number today that we're initiating for the city's long-range vision. So how do we get to 1.3 million from where we are now? We need to find ways to accommodate 800,000 new residents. Now, where do they go? Downtown. I just told you that's not going to happen. Are they going to live in the Beltline? Probably not all of them. A certain share will. Where will they go? But before we go into where they go, let's try to cast about what is it that we want Atlanta to retain as critical characteristics, and how do we want the new growth to occur in Atlanta to make Atlanta an even greater Atlanta? Create an even more Atlanta kind of Atlanta. That's a term that Ryan Gravel told me, and I think it makes a lot of sense intuitively. I had to think about it, but linear spines of density and transit investment. We already have that up and down Peachtree, but we need to expand that to east-west laterals and further south. focused development of brownfields, aging strip centers, but also we need to protect neighborhoods next door to them. And you'd be surprised, Atlanta's done a pretty good job on the whole of protecting neighborhoods where you have this encroachment of large commercial into neighborhood areas. I commend the city's Buckhead planning done many decades ago now, because they successfully protected neighborhoods from the explosive growth that Buckhead has. So there are some lessons there that can be learned and transferred elsewhere in the city. Implement the context-sensitive Beltline plan. I read those plans over the weekend, all 10 of them. It's a lot of reading to do. I didn't read every word, but I got the idea that the designers and the analysts got what Atlanta is as represented around the Beltline, and so the planning done around the Beltline is sensitive to what's already there, maximizing the advantages already there, and so the individual segments become better based on the foundation that already exists. They're brilliant plans in my view. But we need to make sure that most infill and redevelopment in Atlanta is what I call below the tree line. One thing that distinguishes Atlanta from many other cities is that we have this wonderful canopy of trees, and they run about 50 feet high or thereabouts, give or take, all kinds of trees, magnolias and pines and so forth and so on. You can have well-designed density below the tree line with the trees, and you couldn't even see the developments across the street, and certainly not down the block. This is some advantage that you have here because of your terrain and climate and vegetation structures. You can actually maximize your density and minimize the visual impact of that density on your landscape. And then preserving the leafy canopy of the single-family neighborhoods. That's very important in my view. Okay, so where do we put 800,000 new people? In my view, there's infill and redevelopment, mostly along existing corridors, commercial corridors, downtown, midtown, Buckhead centers, and the Atlanta Beltline. So let's talk about the infill redevelopment along commercial corridors first. Some of you might know this. I use this slide all around the country, but it's actually from Atlanta. It's off Memorial Drive. It's about 5 miles from downtown. Now, this is maybe the only one of these you have in Atlanta, is that right? Just checking. There are certain characteristics about these things, dead or dying strip centers, that are wonderful opportunities for the future. They're flat. Didn't used to be, but they're flat now. They are fronted by 4 and 6 and 8 lane highways that are transit ready. You stick a bus rapid transit down these things, or maybe a rail for streetcar or light rail, whatever it is. These are transit ready corridors, ready to go. If you need to upgrade the infrastructure, just rip it up out of the front and put it in. Very, very cost effective. The people behind here, this is a residential neighborhood, they're not too happy about butting up against a dead or dying strip center. Now, they're going to be NIMBYs, right, not in my backyard, unless we find a way to make them YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard, fix this, please. And we fix that by engaging neighbors and property owners to redesign this so that everybody benefits. And we know how to do that. The people at Georgia Tech and Ryan Gravel and others around town, they know how to do that. And so Atlanta is actually blessed by having talent already in town who can do those things. So I look more globally at the U.S., the national supply of redevelopment of privately owned, non-residential parking lots. If you added up all of the parking lots of all the non-residential spaces in the U.S., they exceed 10,000 square miles, or the land area of New Jersey, otherwise known as the Garden State. Now, one reason these are opportunities is that the most buildings built on these sites, non-residential sites, don't last very long. This chart shows the average lifespan of key structures based on research I've done and others. So, homes. When you approve a residential subdivision or a residential project, believe it or not, and I don't believe it, but the numbers don't lie, the typical home will last 170 years. Now, it's not built to last that long, right? But the people living in these homes view them as their vessels to their community and their families. They will keep their vessel afloat. The new roof, the new HVAC, the new insulation, whatever it takes, they're going to keep that vessel afloat. So I try to tell planners around the country, when you approve a residential development, take that parcel off the map, period, for any redevelopment thinking. You know, I don't want to over-dramatize. Certainly there will be occasions where you can rethink it. But by and large, when you approve residential, that property is off your map forever. In contrast, these other non-residential land uses, retail goes 20 years, warehouse 25 years. The average for non-residential is about 45 years in useful life. Well, that means that between 2010 and 2050, nearly the equivalent of all the space existing, all the non-residential space existing in metro Atlanta, and certainly the city of Atlanta, will have been replaced by then. Oftentimes demolished and rebuilt, or sometimes rehabilitated and repurposed, but in some major fashion replaced. I'm an economist, so I do some numbers. Here's what's going on in the mindset of property owners, commercial property owners. I build a building that opens tomorrow morning. It's an office building. It has a 50-year useful life. So 80% of the value of the whole site is the structure itself, and it depreciates at 2% per year using Marshall and Swift, 2% per year, so at year 50 it's essentially worthless for depreciation purposes. But the land does not depreciate. The land appreciates. It gains value over the years. It gains value oftentimes on a compounded schedule. So at a 2%, your land values in most of Atlanta are increasing at about 2% per year compounded. So watch the 20% line. So at some point, the land becomes more valuable than the building itself, in this case 28 years. At some point, the property owner will say, I've got to find a way to unlock the value of the land to make more money, all right? Make more money. That'll happen some years before this event, and certainly some years after this event. So at some point in time, the property owners will want to redevelop their property to the next highest and best use. That's a natural, positive thing to do. But we need to seize these opportunities in our planning to make them work for Atlanta. So this is the product of an algorithm we did when I was at University of Utah for Salt Lake County, population 1 million. We looked at every single non-residential property, and we estimated within 5-year bands when each of them had the situation where the land value was more than the building value. And the darker the color, the more immediate the opportunity. Like that's yesterday morning. But look here, if you look at, planners should look ahead. If we look ahead to this strip here, this strip is sort of a 2030. By 2030, these properties are toast, meaning that the land is worth more than the buildings. So what if we did something novel, like plan ahead, and we engaged the property owners and the residential neighborhoods? We brought them in and we showed them the numbers. You'd be surprised how many property owners don't even know when their property will become an opportunity for redevelopment. Show them the numbers, show the neighbors the numbers. Get people thinking about what should happen next. What is the next highest and best use for this strip here in 2030, 2040? Now, that might seem difficult to do, but it's not difficult to do. Market analysts, planners, designers know pretty much in 20, 30-year horizons what's going to happen next. Not 100 years, but 20, 30 years is certainly manageable. So what if everybody got together here, and next year came up with a sector plan that the neighbors bought into, the property owners bought into, that allowed the next highest and best uses to be mixed, higher density, maybe 2 or 3 times the overall land use intensity, and so that in 2022, this person comes in for a permit to do exactly what the sector plan says. There's no rezoning needed. There are few public hearings needed, if any. It's essentially across-the-counter approval. It's been pre-approved. Think of the market efficiencies. And by the way, the neighborhoods have already bought into it. So long as you stick to the plan, they've already bought into it. So you reduce or eliminate vastly the NIMBYism and the confrontation on the case-by-case, the piecemeal-by-piecemeal zone changes that are going to occur anyway. Imagine doing this across the entire city so that in 4 or 5 years, when you've done this mapping and planning, you've made the city welcoming for change on your terms, on the neighbor's terms. And Ellen Dunham Jones here at Georgia Tech has written a book on this with her colleague June Williamson. They have actually changed the nature of thinking across the country. So you have a lot of talent already here at Georgia Tech to help you think ahead on these things. So let's run some of the numbers. I'm a numbers guy. Don't have me design anything, right? Right now, today, the city of Atlanta has about 200 million square feet of non-residential space. It's averaging about a 0.2 FAR, floor area ratio. That means the ratio of building space to land area. 0.2 FAR means that 80% of the land is asphalt. That's what that number means. And by the way, you're actually a little higher than the national average. The national average is 0.15. 85% of the land is asphalt. 70% or more of your non-residential structures are 1 and 2 floors with no elevators, cheaply constructed, and they're more than 20 years old. This building stock is toast by 2050. This is a wonderful opportunity to plan ahead now for converting the 1 floor and 2 floor 0.2 FARs into something very interesting, very attractive, very much Atlantan. There's about 20,000 acres of land potential to be redeveloped between now and 2040 along your commercial corridors. This is low-hanging fruit, and all of this can be done below the tree line. And you can hit a 0.7 FAR, which sounds like a lot. Moving from 0.2 to 0.7 sounds like a lot. No, it's nothing. You have some residential mixed with some retail, mixed with some service, mixed with some office. And you have adequate parking, by the way. And if you run any kind of semblance of a streetcar or a light rail or a bus rapid transit down the corridor, you make the land uses much more efficient. This is eminently possible. And again, the designers around town at Georgia Tech know how to do this around the country and here. So if you run the numbers again, these 20,000 acres, and I'm being very conservative. I think the number's actually twice this, but let's be very conservative. 500,000 people and 500,000 jobs could locate along these redeveloped commercial corridors that will be redeveloped anyway if you do it right, if you do it your way. Let's look at the centers, downtown, Buckhead, and Midtown. Now, let's assume for a minute that only 2% of the metropolitan population wants to live in a downtown, and let's divide that 2% into 1% for downtown and 1% for Buckhead. What that means is that by 2050, about 100,000 people, give or take, would want to live in downtown Atlanta compared to 25,000 people now. This is low-hanging fruit. This is something you can plan for. Ditto for Buckhead, same population base, another 100,000 people would want to live in whatever downtown Buckhead is, the Buckhead concept. We'll call it the Buckhead concept. That's a real number, real demand. Midtown, let's assume only 0.5% of the metropolitan population wants to live in Midtown. Currently population 14,000, up to 50,000 people by 2050. These are conservative numbers. I have scenarios indicating these numbers could be actually double that. If you made downtown more attractive, oh, by the way, your Centennial Olympic Park, in 2050, that should be ringed with high-value, high-rise residential towers. I don't know what's going on right now, but the market demand will be there for residential, high-value homes, towers around your park. So you need to plan for that. The Beltline, the other part of this equation. 10 segments, 10 planning segments. I've read them all, as I mentioned earlier. I go around the country and actually mention the Atlanta Beltline as a wonderful redevelopment opportunity. I mentioned Ryan Gravell's name as well, positively, of course. So much so that now around the country, when I go around the country, I mentioned the Beltline, Atlanta Beltline, there's Beltline envy. Kansas City says, can we do that here? We looked, doesn't work. You have an unusual situation here where you do have this circular possibility around downtown, and it doesn't exist many other places, and that's why many people are envious of Atlanta. And I think you're doing it right. You're doing the planning right. I read the plans, as I said, but let's run the numbers on those plans. Now, the plans actually vary in designs and projections to a 2020 scenario and a 2030 scenario and a build-out scenario. So I did some liberties and assumed a 2050 overall build-out scenario for the plans, added all the numbers up, and basically you have the potential capacity to add 20 million square feet of non-residential space around the 20-mile circumference of the Beltline. That's really a small number, less than 10% of all such space in the whole city, and about 250,000 people around the 22-mile circumference of the Beltline. Again, that's a small number. The market demand could be twice or three times that, but let's be conservative and say 250,000 people. If we add everything up, we've got plenty of room. Remember all those numbers, 500,000 here, and 250,000 there, and 250,000 there. We have a base of 500,000 people. We have more than enough opportunity between now and 2050 to add another 800,000 people to the city without doing much at all in terms of changing residential neighborhoods. It will take some effort to do your advanced planning right and advanced design right, but you can do those things. And so all of that development, most of that development, by the way, as I said before, can be below the tree line. You wouldn't really see it until you're right at the doorstep of it. And existing neighborhoods can, of course, be preserved. Now, maybe not all neighborhoods. We all know examples where maybe some neighborhoods need to be redeveloped, but those are probably a few in number. So by and large, we preserve the existing residential neighborhoods. There are certain benefits to adding the population and the jobs and so on and so forth. Now, I have another whole lecture on those benefits, but to summarize, when you have large, compact cities like Atlanta could become, you would have what's called economic resilience. You'd be better able to weather the economic downturns. We know from studies that more compact and larger cities lose fewer jobs and have higher employment rates during recessions than other cities, even comparably sized cities that are more spread out. During recessions, property values are retained at a higher level in large, compact cities than in sprawling ones. Compare Houston, say, to Atlanta in the future. Emerging studies show that larger, more compact areas with good urban design have higher personal well-being scores. And this is something odd. You would think that people don't want to be around people, You want to be in your farm and say hello to your cow as it goes by. But the odd thing is, we know from studies that people cherish being around other people, even if they don't like them. Go figure. So we need to tap into that inherent human trait. And of course, the environmental impact is far lower per person. There was a book some years ago, and I forget who the author was, comparing New York City to Colorado. Back in the wilderness, survivalists in Colorado are saying, we're more environmentally friendly. The book said, no. The average New Yorker had like 1/10 the environmental impact per person than the back to the nature survivalists, or thereabouts. There's also a tremendous fiscal savings, the property tax savings. When you double your population in the same space, that means you can double the number of units using the same water line, sewer line, schools perhaps, fire and sewer and police and so on and so forth. So various studies have shown that if you move from the current density of Atlanta, which is in this bracket here actually, this is the current density of Atlanta, about 1,500 units per acre, to something over here by 2050, we will save about 36%, call it 40%, per housing unit in public facility costs. We are efficient. When you add another housing unit to an existing sewer line, the marginal cost of that additional housing unit is zero, and the average cost goes down. That's a good thing in economics. That means you're saving money, and you can invest that money either in the form of tax cuts or rate cuts, or the city council could invest the money into more amenities to make the city more attractive to the people already living here. There are lots of things you can do when you're saving $8,000 per new residential unit to make the city better or add to the pockets of the taxpayers. This is possible here in Atlanta. Savings in the order of billions of dollars by going from 500,000 people to 1.3 million people, even though you have to add infrastructure improvements here and there. But the overall savings will be very demonstrably larger. There is the jobs equation, of course. Now, I don't spend a lot of time on this here, but suffice it to say that by moving from 500,000 people now to 1.3 million people, in order to retain the current balance of jobs to people, we'd have to have 1 million jobs by 2050 in the city, or 2.5 times more than what we have now in the city. We have 400,000 jobs in the city now. We'd have to move to 1 million jobs. But more to the point, it's not that you're necessarily trying to lure jobs away from suburbs. Jobs increasingly are going to where people live. If you're in the knowledge sector, the knowledge jobs come to you. If you're living in Atlanta because you like the amenities, you like the proximity to transit, those jobs come to you because you're the talent those jobs are looking for. And there's something else. If you take the space of Atlanta and add, 1 million more people to Atlanta, 800,000 people, and the jobs, you have economic efficiencies taking place. You reduce the transaction costs in doing business. You add more business opportunities among different sectors. And the result is that you can, on top of the jobs you would have anyway, you'd create 70,000 more new jobs that wouldn't be there otherwise. The efficiency effect jobs is what I might call it. A $3 billion per year annual payroll, over and above what you'd already have anyway, because of the way you're becoming more compact and well designed. This is an economic opportunity waiting to be tapped. Now, my overall strip node development centers, Atlanta Beltline scenarios that I laid out to you have enough room and more to accommodate all the new population and all the new jobs, including the additional jobs that you can get by being very efficient and very well designed. I do a lot of traveling around the country, and I mention occasionally, actually often, that I spent some time in Atlanta, and they like Atlanta. People who haven't even been to Atlanta tend to say, yeah, Atlanta, that sounds nice. Of course it is nice. You have a positive external image, as opposed to other cities you can well imagine. You have a solid business reputation. You're ranked way up there in terms of business, Forbes and other magazines in terms of business friendliness. A string of successes. The Olympics did wonders for putting Atlanta on the map, and other successes. You have the Beltline envy going on that I mentioned earlier. You're well known for productive collaboration between different interests. That's what makes Atlanta's culture so inviting. We want you to come on down and be with us, to work with us, to continue building a great city. And along with that, you have all the ingredients. Cities that don't grow and change die. You have the ingredients to keep renewing the city that you have, called the City of Atlanta. Thank you very much.
We're going to spend some time here and take questions and comments. As I've often said, I prefer comments to questions. Before we get into that, I do want to thank a few other people that are here. Jay Tribby's here from Kwanzaa Hall's office. We have Keisha Powell with us, who's the commissioner of our watershed department, and I hope you can meet her. She's new to Atlanta while you're here tonight. And then our wonderful commissioner of parks and recreation, Amy Fong, and wonderful police chief, George Turner, who are all here with us. And I'll say this about the city overall, not just folks in this room, but the city as an organization. Nobody knows what we're doing. Exactly. What is all this about? That will become clear as we move forward with this thing, but it's very much about putting, as I said, the city in charge of its future. And for all of us, whether it's Watershed or the police department or whoever, that we get very specific about how the city's going to grow physically, that we have a plan that's saying, this is how many people will be here, this is how many jobs we will have, and this is where they will be. So that if you're planning for fire stations or if you're planning for where you'll have more water and sewer customers, you have a clearer sense of that. That's our responsibility in this process. So what we're going to do in terms of comments, what's that? Yeah, I recognize Councilmember Norwood earlier. We actually have a mic down here if you want to come down, and there's an X on the floor, which you need to stand on. The reason for the X is not to, I'm sorry. Our city council president, Caesar Mitchell, is here. Thank you for being here. I did not see you. I apologize for that. The reason for the X, not to be concerned about it, is just that there's a video being recorded here, so if you stand on the X, the video will be better, because we want to put this out after we're done. So with that, anyone? Yes, okay, good. You're sitting on the X, really. I mean.
So a question and kind of a clarification from Dr. Nelson. I saw so much of the presentation about corridors, nodes, keeping residential neighborhoods as they are protected. Do you mean single family only neighborhoods? Could you clarify walkable neighborhoods, mixed uses?
No, a great question, really. It's all residential areas. You have wonderful attached residential communities in this city. And I meant to preserve all of the residential communities. And I shouldn't say all either, but the lion's share that are established, stable, great identity, they need to be preserved.
But that doesn't necessarily mean there's not a mix of uses in those neighborhoods.
No. And of course, I would hope that actually let's advance the conversation. So let's say even in the most ardent, single-family, detached, tree-canopied neighborhood you can find, there's going to be an opportunity to have something available in that neighborhood to serve their local needs. A store, a set of services, a doctor's office, whatever it is. There are always going to be places for those, and they should be met. But we're not talking about wholesale change in that neighborhood. We're talking about supporting that neighborhood through other mixed uses where it's appropriate.
And just real quickly to take us back to the main topic tonight and what we'd asked Dr. Nelson to share with us is to give us some national perspective and market perspective on what the potential for growth in the city is. So that number, he's describing 1.3 as a reasonable aspirational goal. That is 15% of the population of the region in 2050 that one would think would want to live in the city of Atlanta, that 15% being the 1.3 million. I'll mention that he also said about 40% want to live in walkable, transit-friendly places, which gets you to, if in 2050, a city of 3.5 million. But anyway, the 1.3 million to start designing around is what we were trying to really focus on tonight. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Tariq Abdullah. I'm a local architect in the downtown Atlanta community. And I'm very interested in how education impacts this design process.
Thank you for that. So let me say this about that, and anyone else want to speak on this? But We had a
I don't
pre-meeting.
draw, so I'm not going to answer that.
We had a meeting before this with a group, and we invited a number of city staff to this with Dr. Nelson to start talking about this. And among the group that was with us was the chief operating officer for the Atlanta Public Schools, and a group from the Atlanta Public Schools that includes their planner and demographer, because we see them as not a focus group, not someone that we want to check in on every now and then, but as fundamentally a part of this planning team, that we need to incorporate their plans. It needs to be a process with them included to see how our design might shape what they're thinking about their plans. Now, their plans are focused obviously on teaching children, and they have a forward-thinking plan now that we want to incorporate into this, but allow them to participate in this process with us. We recognize that you could argue if all we did was focus on the public schools, we don't need to worry about anything else. Everything else will take care of itself. So that is, I just say that to say that's how important this is to us, that they're an active, engaged participant with us every day on this process. Someone want to come up? Yeah. It's not a good queuing situation, but.
Hi, my name is Tarunya, and I'm a student at Georgia Tech, which you mentioned a couple of times. I guess this is a combination of a comment and a question. I'm concerned about the fact that you did mention water and sewer and the watershed, but there were no numbers, and we know that Atlanta doesn't necessarily have the best history with water and sewer. So I wanted to know, have there been any numbers, and like what's happening in that direction? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, this is, again, one aspect of this is that, as Ryan really discussed, that the change is going to happen. There's an expectation that the region will grow by 2.5 million people over the next 20 plus years. Based on the history of this place, I would suggest that's a reasonable expectation, that we'll go from 6 million or so, a little less than that, to close to 8 million. So we're not talking about a choice between something and nothing. It's a choice between something and something else. And so that there's inherent value, as Dr. Nelson largely outlined, in the city capturing a really significant part of that growth, but we will have to have the capacity to serve those people. And that's why everyone, and our new commissioner, Keisha Powell in particular, as it relates to this subject, will be participating, and we've already heard a little from her about the challenges she has and how there will be nothing but value that comes from this process in terms of that issue specifically. So I don't want to go further than that right now, just because I'll get into land that I don't know well enough. But we will get into it in this process. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if Dr. Nelson could comment. You talked about people wanting to live in the city and an unmet market. Can you talk about people being able to afford to live in the city? Are you talking about wanting to, or actually being able to afford to also?
Yeah, the affordability is always a complex issue. There's the federal definition of affordability that I actually don't care for very much. If you don't meet the market demand of roughly 1.3 million people living in the city in 2030, that means you'll have more demand than supply, and you'll raise prices. So by not meeting market demands across the segments, you're actually going to cause market distortions, raising prices, which causes unaffordability issues. Now, that's not to say that the magic number is 1.3 million people, because then everything's affordable. No, of course not. But you have a better chance of meeting affordability goals by meeting market needs as well.
Yes.
I'm on the X.
Yes, you're right on it.
Hi, Andrew Tate from Advance Atlanta board. We're a transit advocacy organization of young professionals in Atlanta. The question is really for both of you guys, actually. So as a follow-up to what you were just speaking about, in terms of affordability, I know you guys have been looking at, the city's been looking a little bit at micro housing, but I'm also really curious about what you've been considering with micro units in apartments. I know Toronto's had huge success with those. New York's been trying them out, other cities as well. So I'd like to hear what Dr. Nelson knows about that and how that's playing into affordability and absorption and how those fit into, you know, rental rates. And also I'd like to hear from you, Tim, about what the city is considering in terms of development of those units and changing the zoning codes, et cetera.
That's a really good question, and I'm glad you raised it. Through our zoning codes, we're not properly understanding the wonderful mix, the wonderful diversity of housing needs and housing preferences across the country. And yes, tiny homes are one of those things. They're on TV and all this stuff, and it's the glamorous thing to see these days. But underlying that is being more flexible in our thinking about what constitutes a housing unit. Now, for a long time, and I need to study more about the tiny home unit movement, but for the longest time, I've been advocating for accessory dwelling units, ADUs. In most neighborhoods I know across the country, including Atlanta, you can have an ADU across-the-counter permitting process that unleashes the inefficiently used spaces of existing occupied homes and meet important housing needs for the seniors, for the young people coming out of college who have no place to go. And these accessory dwelling unit residents are additional eyes on the street, additional eyes on the house itself, caregivers in some cases for the primary occupant. We need to unleash the potential that the homes already have to meet housing needs that are very important. And by the way, if you did that, if you had a smart, efficient way to have an ADU policy in this city and other cities around the country, you could meet up to 10% of all new housing demand just in existing single-family homes. Think about that.
A couple things about it for me. One is we do have a working group right now on the issue of micro units and tiny houses, and they're going to make a series of recommendations about ordinance changes and policies the city needs to enact in order to enable those. I would say overall, if you look at the city moving forward and accommodating this amount of development, one aspect that we anticipate in this is that while the neighborhoods won't change substantially, I mean, within a design for the city, there's going to be a lot of protections for the existing historic neighborhoods in the city. A way they can grow is through housing types that many of our neighborhoods have had since their inception. I mean, you go through the old neighborhoods of Atlanta, of course, and you see all different types of housing that are very compatible with single-family homes, duplexes, small apartment buildings, those kinds of things. That there is some palette of residential housing types that would enable our neighborhoods to grow in this process too. Not a lot. It's not going to change the character of the neighborhood, but that we should enable those things. The second thing I'll say about it, and some of you have heard me talk about this and are tired of it, I'm sure, but this is so important. Another thing that we'll be working on, in the city studio will get going with this early in the next calendar year, is what it's going to be like to live in the city of Atlanta as a low-income person in the future. The fundamentals, and I'm talking, my biggest concern is low-income housing. I mean, there's many concerns, but low-income people are the ones that the city is most focused on because the public typically is helping them with their housing somehow through some kind of subsidy. And the fundamentals of building low-income housing in the city are not working in this way. The demand or the need for it is going up, and it's probably bigger than we even think if we're to get to 1.3 million people and have a very diverse population with a lot of low-income people living in the city, which is what we want. So the demand is going up. The cost of building it is also going up. The land prices and the construction costs are going up, and the public subsidy for it is going down. That's the scenario that doesn't work. And so there are many other cities in this world, as you know, that have much more tightly constrained market conditions, even less supply of land, even higher demand, that are examining how it's going to be to live in those cities as low-income people. And not that you're settling for something, but the studio will, early in next year, kick off a project which is really studying this issue and saying, we want to understand how to build low-income housing in much greater quantities that's beautiful for people to live in, and they love it, but that's not a conventional suburban apartment building or whatever, because that can't be the future in the city, or we won't have enough low-income housing. We've got to find another way to design and develop low-income housing in the city, and this will be going on while this design project's going on. Enough about that, I'm sure. Yes, sir, you want to come on up? Yeah.
Okay. So my question is, I've lived here for about a year, and what I see is lots of development happening, like Roswell Road, Peachtree Road, Spring Street, high rises going up down there now. Looks like nobody's planned, like the traffic is already out of control. So like, how are you guys planning to take care of that? Because it's already impassable at this point.
You want to talk about traffic? Please help us with traffic. I'll speak.
I can answer that because I've got the airplane ticket heading out of town.
So it looks like it's just like, whatever, right? I mean, you're making me think that.
Well, nobody likes congestion, I guess. But let's look at congestion differently. Not that I'll change your minds about congestion and growth congestion. So there's the Texas Transportation Institute every year comes out with its mobility index, and it estimates for all the metropolitan areas the congestion costs imposed on society by waiting in traffic during congested periods of time. And by golly, cities are, congested to the billions of dollars a year, including Atlanta. It's a bad thing. We need to build more roads everywhere and relieve congestion. Well, I did a dumb thing one day. I gathered data, and I regressed economic development with congestion. And gosh, it's surprising to me that the more congested a city, the higher the wages. The more congested a city, the higher the employment rate. The more congested the city, the more resilient it was to economic downturns. The more congested the city, the lower the foreclosure rates. So, not to say that there are benefits of congestion and that you should design congestion into your system, but congestion is nothing more than an indicator of success.
I will speak. You can tell we're downtown. I do want to say, though, that an aspect of this design project, we have to update our transportation plan by the end of next year. So we are in the midst of engaging a team that will work alongside us in the city design project to actually address the transportation aspect of this, because all these things are important. All the ways we get around the city are important. And I think, though, to the point here, there's a recognition that if we grow by 2.5 million people in this region over the next 20 to 30 years, and all of those people have to drive all the time, then that's the worst case scenario. And that really all we can do with regard to congestion is ensure that many, many of those people live in places where they don't have to drive that much. I mean, it's really kind of what this place has to do. I mean, reasonably, that's just the scenario that will be, but we have to get real specific about it in this design as to how do you then accomplish that? What specifically do you do? So hopefully this project will, very much influence how we invest in public transit and other things in the coming years. Okay, we got two more. We'll take two more questions here and then let you go. So yeah, come on up. Hey.
Hey, Jim Backstrom. So I was struck by your note comment that 1% of the region's population would live in the downtown, want to live in the downtown area no matter how bad it is. We currently have, according to my expert, 15,000 residents downtown and a demand for 60,000. Why isn't his department overwhelmed with applications for high-rises?
Well, I can't speak for what the bottlenecks might be in Atlanta. I have some familiarity with other cities around the country, Seattle, Portland, Minneapolis, Denver. They all have very proactive public-private partnerships with the development and landowner communities to facilitate downtown housing development of all levels of income. And it's not easy because you're talking about already built land, renovation, demolition costs, the zoning processes, the financing especially. It is not easy. But a lot of cities in this country have figured it out, at least for them, and are making it happen. And so, as good as Atlanta is, and it is one of the leaders in the country, more probably could be done to learn the lessons from other places and apply them here.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Steve Williams, concerned citizen and try to work in water conservation. I'm glad they brought up the water issues for infrastructure and quality because we are getting into the last phases of the Supreme Court trial. So just to let you guys know. But my concern, I guess, is with the tendency to build luxury housing and the large sizes. I've lived on the east side from Virginia Highlands to Cabbagetown and watched that develop from the late 80s till present. And there's a mentality not only with the building community but with the people that are buying the houses is that we need to have really nice and big houses. And that's, I think, what is driving up the cost of housing. And people are building houses that are really a lot bigger than they need. And so I was wondering if you're going to try to come up with a way to change the mentality.
Well, I'm interested in your thoughts about big suburban houses.
Because if you can't, okay. And also for transportation, for all those that are now going to lose their jobs in the transportation industry, bike riding works pretty good. So.
Yeah, this is not an easy question because it's a loaded question and appropriately loaded, I think. On the one hand, I do say, and you've heard me say, meet the market demand, and there is a legitimate market demand for the larger homes and the larger lots, and we need to accommodate that. Probably, though, where it makes sense. I'm not sure, case by case, it might make sense in some places, others not. But we need to have a collateral approach so that when the markets change, that large home on that large lot, or the large home period, could be in some fashion reused for accommodating maybe more people through ADUs or dividing the house up into sub-units for more households. Now, as an example, when we moved to Alexandria, Virginia in 2002, I was very fortunate in starting the planning program for Virginia Tech there. That's why I left Georgia Tech. How many times in a person's life are you asked to start a planning program? I did not want to pass up that opportunity. It meant leaving Atlanta. But we lived in a house in Alexandria that was a single-family house by design. It started off as a triplex, a living unit in the basement, a two-floor main living area, and a living unit in the upstairs, each with their own kitchen, each with their own bathrooms, each with their own entrances. The house then, after World War II, went into a single-family dwelling, and then it moved back and forth over the years. We bought it as a single-family dwelling, and we asked the building inspector, what is with these odd designs? He says, well, this house was designed as a single-family home to be used as a triplex. I'm thinking that we should, if we're going to allow, and we should allow, the larger homes, maybe we also require as part of the design an alternative scheme to subtly change doors and entrances and so forth so that large home 30 years from now, 50 years from now, can be converted without approvals and permitting into a duplex or threeplex and still stay standing but meet more housing needs.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. And so you're going to hear us talk a lot about 1.3 million people, I think, at this point moving forward. That was the main topic tonight and what we'd asked Dr. Nelson to focus on. Our next event, as I said, will be October 4th here at 6 o'clock, and the topic will really be the city design project, so we can start putting that, start shaping that as a community. I'll thank Councilmember Norwood and City Council President Caesar Mitchell again for joining us on a Thursday night to talk about such things. Really appreciate you being here. Again, we'll see you soon. Thank you.